Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. Feels like it's been quite a while since I put up a new video, but today really excited to bring you guys a lesson on how to build out one of the most common UI patterns you'll find inside of a typical iOS application. So let me show you quickly using the core data course that we've been working on so far. And here is our application that is listing out a bunch of companies inside a very simple UI table view. I'm going to click into Apple, and this is going to lead me into the employees that belong into this particular company. Now, what's nice about the UI pattern here is that we have a bunch of sections for the different types of employees for our company. So for example, we have executive on the top, which contains Tim Cook, Steve Jobs, and Craig F. I can't really pronounce his last name. And in addition to that, we have senior management as well as staff on the bottom. Now, once you're able to establish this type of UI pattern, you can also manage the insertion of employees like this. So let me create Steve Wozniak over here. And Steve Wozniak is definitely not an executive, so let's just put him inside of senior management. And I will give him a birthday of 0102 and 1111, hit the save, and the moment I do this, he's going to be inserted inside of this middle section like that. And if you wanted to delete, you can swipe over if you really wanted to, and he'll just go away. Okay, so this UI pattern over here is pretty typical, and you'll find it a lot inside of real-world applications. So I would like to illustrate how to build out something like this by using a much simpler application over here. And I'm going to refer to this as the contacts application. And you can see that it is very similar in terms of how the UI looks like. We have a lot of sections, and all of the names inside of each section is pretty much grouped by the first letter of the name. And in order to kind of understand how this really works, you have to start off with something simpler by just using a list without any sections at all. And it's also really helpful to list out what exactly this section and the row number is, kind of like this on the right side. Now, once we're done with building out the general structure for this application, I would also like to show you how to integrate some of these neat looking animations like this, like that, and also this over here that slides from the left to the right. And that's all really cool because it adds a lot to what your UI does. All right, so this is what our project looks like. And now that you understand what our task is, let's go ahead and jump into Xcode and build it all out. Okay, so here we are inside of Xcode, and I've created a brand new single view application. And you pretty much start off with this class called ViewController. And let's just run this to make sure that our application is able to compile and we get this blank white screen like what you're seeing inside of the simulator. Now, the first thing I need to do is to modify this class to be UITableViewController so that I can kind of get a list going, right? And if you run your application now, you actually don't get your table view controller. And let me show you the proper fix by heading into app delegate. So you see we have a crash here. Let me stop my application and head inside of did finish launching with options. So here is where we are going to manually create our UI window like that. And you always have to make it visible when you're doing this. And then finally, you have to set the Windows root view controller equal to something. And this is going to be our view controller class. And let me just run this right now. View controller is actually this class over here. And so rendering out our list now inside of our simulator, it kind of looks like this with these very faint horizontal lines inside of our app. So that's pretty good. And the thing that I would like to do now is to get a navigation bar at the very top there. So let's head back to app delegate, and I'll construct it right above with nav controller equals UI navigation controller. And inside of here, the root view controller needs to be this thing called view controller. So let me cut, paste, and now I'll set the root of my entire window to be nav controller. And so if you're unfamiliar with window, it's pretty much the entire window for your application. And whatever the root is going to show up as the very first screen. All right, so here we are with our table view inside of a navigation controller. And you can see the gray nav bar at the very top there. And also, this is how we construct our views programmatically. I actually think it's easier to understand when you write your code out like this. So we're going to head back to the view controller over here. And what I can do is to now set the title of our application with this navigation item title equals perhaps contacts, like that. And one thing I would like to do is to actually turn our title into this large version of the title. And the way you would do that is to perhaps say navigation controller dot navigation bar dot prefers large titles equals to true. And now we'll just run this and you'll see exactly what this does for our nav bar at the very top. It's going to make our application look a lot better, and that's kind of what we get. Okay, so moving on here, I would like to slowly transform my UITableView into a list that contains a row of names, kind of like what we're seeing over here. So the way you would actually do this is to first provide the number of rows in section for your table view. So I'm just going to say return something like 10, so that will give me 10 rows for my list. And the next thing you have to do is to provide the cell for each one of these rows. Now this cell, you have to actually dequeue it from the table view. So let's just do it first, and then perhaps we'll kind of explain why we have to do this. And the way you dequeue is to call dequeue reusable cell with some kind of cell ID, which I'll create up here. Let cell ID equals cell ID, and this is just a raw string, pump it in there. And then for the index path, we'll use this guy. Paste that in there, and then somewhere over here you can say cell.text label.text equals something, and let's just type it there, return our cell. And if you run your application now, you're going to get a crash because the dequeue process actually requires the table view to register a cell first. So you just do that inside of viewDidLoad, and let's just register a cell class. And this guy, you just type in UITableView cell, and you say .self. And here's the important part that you have to remember. The cell ID that you're trying to dequeue has to be the same in terms of the cell that you're registering. So we'll just use cell ID, which is this string over here, which you can change to whatever you want. And we'll just run our application now. And so I'm going through this relatively quickly because I'm going to assume that a lot of you that are watching already know how to construct a table view. And once you have this over here, this, and the registration, you can render out a bunch of rows that say something like this over here. Okay, so now that we have our list going here, I would like to modify it so that it appears a little bit more dynamic. And what I mean is, instead of saying something over here, I would like to actually have each row render out a name string. So let's first declare a property on our view controller called names and set it to some kind of array. And inside of here, I'm just going to list out a bunch of names randomly. So Zach, and let's see, Steve, and what do we have? Jack. That is a pretty good start for now. And so names has 5 strings in it currently, and I will use names as the return value for a number of rows in section. So return names, and to get the actual count, you obviously would just type in .count. And then finally, for the cell's text, instead of something, we will actually get the name out of the names array from up here. So you can either say self.names or just get rid of the self, it doesn't really matter. And inside of here, we'll access the IndexPath.row, and that'll give me the name per row. So instead of something, we'll just punch in the name, and now we can run our application. So instead of getting 10 rows where they all say the text something, we'll get 5 rows that actually render out the name per row, kind of like how we specified in this list above. All right, now so far our list over here has been pretty easy and pretty straightforward to construct, right? And we can also add in as many names in here as we really wanted to, and our list will behave just fine. So let me just rerun it. And I would like to show you how to create sections now, but before I do that, it's much easier to understand how all of this works if you actually add in the index path next to the name over here. So what I mean is I would like to say cell.textLabel.text equals some type of string. So I'm going to use something called string interpolation, and this string will have the name, and then we'll say section, use a colon, and then we'll say index path dot section like that, and then finally we'll just say space and row. And this guy will also print out index path, and on this guy we have a property called row. Remove that space, And now we can run our application, and every row that we have inside of our table view, you'll see exactly what the section and row is. So as you can see, all of the rows inside of here have a section of 0. So that's one very important aspect of how all of this works. And then the row starts from 0 and goes all the way up to 6 or n, depending on how many names you have in this. Okay, so pretty good start. And now I would like to show you how to render out sections for your table view. And somewhere inside of your code, perhaps above number of rows, you can also specify number of sections inside of your table view. So let's return, I don't know, 2. That seems like a pretty good number for testing. Fix the error over here by hitting the fix. And you can run your code now, and you'll see kind of like duplicated sections inside of your table view. And this is exactly what we get. So the duplication occurs on Amy right here, and the list looks exactly the same. Now it's really hard to distinguish these sections if you don't have a separator or a divider. So the way that you would get a divider going, for example, a divider like this over here, these dividers, you would have to say view for header. So view for header inside of a section. So this orange thing is a header. And the way I'm going to get it to show is to use some kind of label. And let's just say label equals UI label, and you have to return this label. Now this label won't be too interesting if you don't set something on it, like a text perhaps. And I think you need to construct it with those 2 parentheses. Set the text equals header, like so. And now you should be able to run it, but I don't think it'll look all that nice. So let me see how it renders inside of our app first, and then I might have to customize the label a little bit. So here we go, we get the header, and we get the header. I guess it looks okay. You can provide label.background color equals, I don't know, UI color.light gray. And that should be easier to see once I run it. And the divider will be a lot more opaque, and you can distinguish the sections much easier. And there is what we get. So these 2 sections are kind of how we are able to render out separate groups inside of our list. All right, so one thing that's great about these sections here is that it's really easy to control how many rows are in each section by going into the number of rows method over here. And let's say if the section is 0, section equals 0, you can return names.count. Otherwise, you can say return something like 2. And what that is going to do is to keep the top section of section 0 with 6 or 7 items, and then the bottom section will have 2 items. So I will run this, and you'll see what kind of effect that has inside of our table view. So top section has 6 or 7 items, and the bottom has 2. And that's kind of how we vary the number of items per section. So you can imagine if I had a second list of names up here, I can use that to control the second section inside of my list. So let me show you how to do that by saying this. Another list of names equals something, and this will be a very similar array. So let's say Carl, Chris, and this will be all names that start with the letter C, Christina, and let's see, Cameron, like that. And now I can use this another list of names down at the bottom for number of rows in section. So instead of returning 2, we'll say another list of names and say count. Now I can run my code now, and everything will be kind of okay. So let's see how the list looks like. And we get 7 items here, and we get 4 items at the very bottom. However, the second section isn't showing the names that I want for my second list of names. So I want to see Carl, Chris, and so on and so forth over here. So the way I would go about doing that is to go inside of cell for row at, and whenever we are deciding the name right here, we have to do something else to figure out which name we want. So let's just say that if the section, so IndexPath.section, if this guy is equal to 0, we will say equals 0. We will say name is actually names. So we'll use ternary operator with names. Let's see, IndexPath.row. Otherwise, we will use another list of names and IndexPath.row. Okay, so let me comment out this line and rerun my application. So this over here is called a ternary operator. It's just shorthand for writing out an if statement. And basically, if we are in section 0, we'll use names with the correct row number. Otherwise, we are in section 1, and we'll use the another list of names, which is the Carl, Chris, Christina, Cameron section at the very bottom. So if you really wanted to rename this list over here, you can do so by right-clicking Refactor, Rename, and we'll call this C names like that. And everything will be renamed like so. Okay, so the final task for today's lesson is to make our sections dynamic as well. And what I mean here is, let's say, for example, that we introduce another list of names. Let's call it D names. And let's just put a couple of names in here that start with the letter D, David and Dan. And that seems pretty good. And that's just 2 names. So you can imagine this list right here should go down below somewhere over there. And you would have to modify it so that you have to return 3 sections instead of just 2. And then you would also have to provide the if check for if section is 0, 1, and 2, return the correct names.count. And then finally, you would have to modify this again for the section check of 0, 1, and 2. So you can do all of that, but it's really hard to maintain that type of code because you have to provide all this if checking. So the way that you would do this a little bit more intelligently is to use something called a 2-dimensional array. So what that looks like is this over here. So let 2-dimensional, let me see if I can spell that correctly, 2-dimensional array equals something. So inside of this array is going to be 3 arrays like that, and like that. All right, so you will not be able to compile this, I don't think, because you don't have the correct types. So what I'm going to do is to provide the names as the very first one, put that in there, the C names as the second section, and then the D names as the third section. Okay, so hopefully you can kind of see what's going to happen. And now with 2-dimensional array, instead of using the raw value of 2 for the number of sections, I'm going to return 2-dimensional array.count. All right, so this value for our current example is 1, 2, and 3, giving me 3 sections. All right, and then the next question is, well, how do we know the number of rows per section? Well, we no longer need this if checking, and all we have to do is return 2-dimensional array, use the section over here, and then we can say dot count. So this really means if we are section 0, which is this over here, we return 7. If we're section 1, we return 4. If we're section 2, we return 2. So we transform this code into this, which is much more dynamic. And then finally, for the cell for row add method, the name that we choose is also going to be much simpler. So let me write that out. Let name equals the 2-dimensional array. Okay, so here is probably the trickier part, and we're going to use a 2-dimensional array accessor with the first little guy as the section. So we'll just say IndexPath.section, and then the second is going to be the IndexPath.row. So for example, if we're row 0 or section 0, this is going to be row 0, giving me Amy. So this is section 0 and 0, section 0 and row 1, section 0 and row 2, and so on and so forth. And this will be section 1, row 0, section 1, row 1, section 2, row 0. And that's how this guy selects the names correctly. So if I run this code now, you'll see all of the names being properly placed inside of each section, and that's kind of what it looks like. So you can see the section and the row inside of each one of our sections over there. Okay, so finally, the nice thing about this approach is that anytime you want to add a different section, all you have to do is modify the 2-dimensional array. So let's say we have an array of names like Patrick, and let's see, Patty, and we can just run our code now. and we'll get a last section that has 2 names, and all we had to do was just simply add in a new section. So you see down here we have Patrick and Patty. So this is a very elegant solution to a very common problem that you'll find inside of iOS. Alright, so that's going to wrap it up for today's video on how to use UITableViews so that you can create sections inside of a list. Now, the solution of using a multi-dimensional array is actually very helpful in accomplishing this task. If you want to download the source code for today's video, make sure to find the link down in the description below. And finally, if you're interested in learning more about Swift development, make sure to check out the intermediate training course with Core Data, where we build out this application on the left side. And so this application over here allows us to save a lot of things inside of Core Data so that it is persisted inside of a database. So for example, if I create a company over here, select some kind of company like BMW, select the date for when they were founded, hit the save, all of this information is actually saved and persisted across sessions for your application. Now, it's a really interesting course and a lot of students have already signed up. Make sure to watch the course preview as well as the first lesson, which is free, using the link down below. Alright, that's going to be it for me today. I'll see you in the next video. Bye bye everyone.